was thinking it was your fault because you've been left in charge, or Manuel's fault for not waking you, and all the time it was my fault. Oh, it's so obvious now. I've seen...
For decades, Fawlty Towers has been remembered as one of the most brilliantly written sitcoms in television history. Sharp, witty, chaotic, and unforgettable. But behind the laughter, behind the iconic scenes and British humour that made the show a classic, there is one episode, one single scene, that became so controversial, so unexpected, and so impossible to ignore, that it didn't just spark outrage, it nearly erased the show from television altogether. And the truth is, most viewers have never seen the original version of that scene. They've only seen the edited replacement, the safe version, the sanitized cut that broadcasters allowed. The raw, unedited version? That was buried, locked away, banned. Yet the real mystery isn't just what was said, or who said it. It's why the scene was removed so quietly, and why the network never wanted the public to know the full story. Was it censorship? Was it political fear? Or was it something far darker, something that even the cast later refused to discuss? What makes this even stranger is that the episode didn't destroy the show immediately. Fawlty Towers didn't get cancelled overnight. Instead, the scene slowly disappeared from reruns, vanished from re-releases, and was quietly replaced in every new broadcast version. Almost like the world was being forced to forget it ever existed. But it did exist, and the few surviving copies reveal something completely different from what most fans remember. And now, decades later, the truth has finally resurfaced. And when you learn what was actually said in that scene and who was responsible, you'll understand why broadcasters panicked, and why even today, it still leaves people speechless. The strange thing about the scene that nearly erased Fawlty Towers from television history is that it didn't come from a forgotten episode or an unaired script. It came from an episode millions of people thought they had already seen. The problem was, the version most viewers remembered was not the version that originally aired. When the episode was first broadcast, it contained a moment so sharp, so unexpected, and so unsettling by today's standards that the network spent years quietly pulling it apart, editing it and re-releasing it as though nothing had ever happened. But the people who watched it the night it aired never forgot it, and neither did the BBC. The episode in question, The Germans, is one of the most famous of the entire series. Ask any fan and they'll quote the same line. Don't mention the war. But what most people don't realize is that the more explosive part of that episode had nothing to do with Basil Fawlty's over-the-top performance. It wasn't John Cleese who crossed the line. It was another character entirely. And what he said was so shocking that even the cast later admitted they were stunned. It made it into the final script. Back then, television was different. There were no instant online backlashes, no social media storms, no hashtags demanding a show be taken off the air. But that didn't mean there were no consequences. Complaints poured in through letters and phone calls. Newspapers criticized the broadcast. And behind the scenes, the BBC had a problem they couldn't ignore. They had allowed something on screen that wasn't just offensive. It was historically loaded, politically radioactive, and deeply uncomfortable for anyone watching who had lived through the era it referenced. Instead of issuing an apology, instead of publicly removing the episode, the network did something far more quiet and far more deliberate. They let the episode continue to air, but only after cutting out the scene completely. They replaced it with a shortened version, a safer version, one that made the controversy disappear without anyone acknowledging it had ever happened. By the time the series was released again in reruns and home video, the full scene was gone. And for years, people assumed the edited version was the original. But every so often, a private collector, a broadcast tape, or a foreign network recording would surface, and the missing dialogue would appear again exactly as it aired the first time. When that happened, it always caused the same reaction: disbelief, shock, and a question nobody could answer. How did this ever get approved? The censorship wasn't just about offensive language. It was about the timing. The episode aired when memories of real war were still fresh, when entire families still carried wounds from a conflict the world was trying to move past. To some viewers, it wasn't comedy. It was a reminder of something too raw to laugh at. But to others, it was satire, a way of exposing ignorance through exaggerated characters. And that was the problem. The scene wasn't easily judged. It wasn't just one thing. It was either a brilliant critique or an unforgivable mistake. For the cast, the controversy didn't come all at once. At first, they didn't even know what had been changed. It wasn't until years later that some of them learned the scene had been removed entirely from new broadcasts. One actor said he assumed it was only trimmed for time. Another admitted he was surprised it was ever allowed to air in the first place. But no one, not even the writers, expected the fallout to grow as the decades passed. Because something else happened, something no one predicted. The world changed, and the scene aged badly. What once caused discomfort now caused outrage. What once was argued as satire was now labeled unacceptable. And when the episode was finally pulled from streaming platforms with public statements and retroactive edits, it wasn't just a TV moment being erased. It was a piece of television history being rewritten. What made the removal of the scene even more strange was the fact that Fawlty Towers had never been a safe show to begin with. Its humor was built on discomfort, misunderstandings, social awkwardness, cultural clashes, and characters who behaved in ways that were completely inappropriate even for the 1970s. The audience knew they weren't supposed to admire Basil Fawlty. They were supposed to laugh at how wrong he was. The comedy worked because it exposed the absurdity of prejudice by exaggerating it. But in this one scene, the line between mocking outdated attitudes and repeating them suddenly became dangerously blurry. The character responsible wasn't Basil, and that's what made it more surprising. It was the aging Major, a recurring guest at the hotel, written to represent a fading generation of old-world British masculinity. He rambled, he told outdated stories, he wore the same clothes every day, and he often seemed unaware that the world had moved on without him. The writers meant for him to be a relic, a way of showing how ridiculous old social biases sounded when spoken out loud. But when his now infamous dialogue aired, its impact didn't land as clever commentary. It landed as shock, not because it wasn't realistic, but because it was too realistic. Viewers weren't laughing at the Major. They were stunned by him. And that was the moment everything changed. When the BBC reviewed the complaints, they were forced to confront a truth they hadn't expected. The scene didn't just offend the people it referenced. It offended the people it was trying to defend. War veterans, immigrants, minority groups, even younger viewers who thought they were prepared for the show's humor, all reacted the same way. How did this get written? How did this get filmed? How did this get approved? Inside the BBC, the conversation became quietly urgent. Some executives wanted a public apology. Some wanted the episode banned entirely. But others worried that making a statement would only call more attention to it. They decided on a compromise, a silent removal. No announcement, no explanation, no re-edit notes. They would leave the episode in circulation, but the scene would disappear forever, replaced by an alternate version that kept the structure of the story while removing the most volatile dialogue. And for a while, it worked. Fawlty Towers continued airing. Reruns continued. New generations grew up watching the edited version without ever knowing something was missing. But television archivists, foreign broadcasters, and a few early fans who recorded VHS copies still had the original. And when those versions resurfaced, the reaction was always the same: confusion. Some people believed the scene was fake. Some believed it was a deep-cut deleted scene. And some believed it had been banned because of modern cancel culture, not realizing the censorship began decades earlier. One interview years later revealed something even more telling. When asked about the scene, several cast members didn't defend it. They didn't condemn it either. They simply said, it belonged to a different time, a time when television was more careless, more unfiltered, more willing to take risks without thinking about who those risks might hurt. But the most powerful reaction came from one person, not a cast member, not a critic, but one of the original writers. When asked whether he regretted including the scene, he paused for a long time before answering. And what he said wasn't defensive. It wasn't an excuse. It was a realization. We thought the joke was making fun of the character. We didn't realize how easily it could be taken as making fun of the people he was talking about. That was the moment the narrative shifted. The question was no longer why did the scene exist, but why did it take so many years for anyone to admit it crossed a line? Because there was one last twist. one that would come later, when streaming platforms began removing episodes and broadcasters began issuing disclaimers. When that happened, the buried scene didn't just resurface. It became a global debate, and fans demanded to know, was the scene removed because it was offensive, or because the world was finally honest enough to admit that it always had been? The shocking part isn't just that the scene was removed, it's how it resurfaced. For years it lived only in memories and rare private recordings. Fans who claimed they saw the original broadcast were often dismissed, told they were confusing it with something else, told their memory was exaggerating the moment. But then a forgotten archive copy appeared, not from the BBC, but from an overseas rebroadcast that never received the edited version. And when the clip finally made its way online, uncut, unaltered, and exactly as it aired in 1975, the internet reacted the same way Britain once did, with disbelief, with anger, with confusion, but also with something no one expected, curiosity. People wanted to know why it was banned. They wanted context. They wanted the full story, not just the clip. And suddenly, a scene that had once been erased was now being shared more widely than it ever was during the show's original run. The attempt to bury it had done the opposite. It turned it into a mystery, a forbidden moment of television that everyone now wanted to see for themselves. And that created a problem the BBC had never prepared for. They could control broadcasting, but they could not control history. The clip spread, not because people agreed with it, but because they were shocked it ever existed. Younger viewers couldn't believe a line like that made it into a scripted sitcom. Older viewers couldn't believe anyone ever thought it was harmless. And critics, historians, and journalists suddenly started asking the question the BBC had spent decades avoiding. Was this censorship or correction? It didn't take long before pressure forced the BBC to publicly acknowledge the scene. But instead of apologizing, they used a different word, context. They argued that the scene wasn't banned because it was hateful, but because its intention no longer translated. What once might have been understood as satire no longer read as satire. The target of the joke had shifted. The audience had changed. And comedy, like time, does not forgive what it leaves behind. But the controversy didn't stop there. Something even more surprising happened. John Cleese, the man who created Basil Fawlty, spoke out, not to defend the scene, but to question the censorship. He argued that the entire point of the Major's speech was to show how outdated and absurd his views were, not to endorse them. He said the BBC had misunderstood its own show. To him, the scene wasn't a mistake. It was a mirror, held up to the worst habits of a generation that believed it was speaking normally while saying things that were deeply wrong. Yet even that defense raised a bigger question. When does satire stop being interpreted as satire? And who gets to decide when the line is crossed, the creator or the audience? What made this debate different from others is that there was no single villain. The actors didn't fight. The writers didn't fight. The fans didn't fight. Everyone simply saw the moment through a different lens. To some, the scene was a historical artifact, proof of how far culture had evolved. To others, it was a reminder that old wounds were never actually healed, only ignored. And to a growing number of viewers, especially younger ones, it was a lesson that even legendary shows can age in ways their creators never intended. But the final twist came when the BBC quietly restored the original version, not to broadcast it, but to preserve it in the archive. They didn't delete it. They didn't destroy it. They simply placed it where it could be studied, not celebrated. A piece of television history that would remain untouched. Not because it was proud, but because it was true. Fans believed the show was simply taken off the air because it was too bold or too ahead of its time. But the real reason cuts much deeper than a single offensive line or a risky performance. The BBC had always known Fawlty Towers was sharp, sarcastic, and unpredictable. What they didn't expect was the cultural shift that began in the late 70s and early 80s, when jokes that once drew laughter suddenly sparked outrage. Television wasn't just entertainment anymore. It was being judged, dissected, and monitored under a brand new spotlight of morality. And Fawlty Towers, once praised as a masterpiece, accidentally found itself on the wrong side of history. That infamous scene didn't just upset a few people. It triggered complaints from politicians, pressure groups, and even former war veterans, who believed the show was mocking something sacred. something that should never be treated as comedy. Letters poured into the network. Protests were organized. Petitions demanded action. And behind the scenes, executives panicked. They weren't worried about art. They were worried about being blamed. They feared headlines, lawsuits, reputation loss, and the possibility that allowing the episode to air again would suggest the BBC supported the message inside it. In modern terms, it was the early version of cancel culture. Long before the phrase even existed, the actors didn't take the backlash lightly either. Some defended the scene as satire, arguing that humor was supposed to expose stupidity, not celebrate it. Others grew uncomfortable, realizing that the jokes they delivered with a smile were now being replayed in a very different world. Even John Cleese himself would later admit that the timing of the joke, not just the joke itself, sealed its fate. What was once seen as edgy comedy suddenly looked like disrespect, and the BBC, instead of protecting the show that they once marketed as fearlessly funny, chose the safest path: silence. They quietly pulled the episode from rotation, scrubbed it from future broadcasts, and pretended it had never existed. But here is the twist that most casual fans don't know. The removal of that one scene didn't just affect the episode. It marked the slow death of the series itself. Once a network decides a show is a problem, every scene becomes a risk, every joke becomes a complaint waiting to happen. Writers began second-guessing themselves. Actors hesitated. Even the studio audience felt the change. The freedom that made the show legendary was gone, replaced by caution, edits, and unspoken rules. And in that moment, the show's spirit was already collapsing, long before the public ever realized it was ending. So why is this moment still talked about today? Because Fawlty Towers wasn't supposed to fade away. It was supposed to be timeless. It was supposed to join the ranks of the greatest British comedies ever made. But instead, its legacy became a warning. A reminder that even genius can be shut down when the world decides it is no longer acceptable. The show didn't run out of ideas. It didn't lose its cast. It didn't fail in ratings. It was removed, not because the audience stopped laughing, but because the people in charge stopped feeling safe. And today, when that scene finally resurfaced, viewers reacted exactly the same way they did decades ago, some laughing, some outraged, some shocked that something so small could shut down something so historic. That is the tragedy of Fawlty Towers. Not that it ended, but that it was never allowed to end on its own terms.